Okay, well, hello, everybody. So it's time we'll get started here with today's last session. So just real briefly, as to where we are, we're at the end of week 5 today. So today is what's today, the 8th, and we're gonna cover chapter 6. I shouldn't say, I was about to say the rest of it. We really need to get started on it, but I think we'll get most of the way, if not maybe even all the way through chapter 6, which deals with utility, and we'll talk about that. When we come back next week on Monday, we will get into chapter 7. And chapter 7 is a very important chapter, and it's going to probably take us all week next week in order to get through it, just because there's so much going on there. And this really is, chapter 7 is sort of we're going to go throughout really the rest of the next several weeks, and that is dealing with economics of business firms, in particular the issue of internal costs of production, how those relate into profitability and what the objectives of firms are. And but chapter 7 is sort of a lead into all that, basically talking about how do we account for cost and what are the different types of costs. And those are all important questions. And so we're going to get to that next week. And then as we go forward, we're coming up on our second exam in week 8. And we'll probably get into a bit of the content of what we call market structure. Market structure, though, as a concept, is probably going to be more in the third segment of the class. I say segment that is sort of differentiated by the exams, and so we'll probably get into the first of the structures prior to the first to the second exam, and then we'll pick it up from there. So this is a really good lead-in chapter, a very important chapter in the sense that it tells us a lot about what we need to know about business firms and whatnot. But before we do that, let's talk about households, and we're going to talk about consumer economics. By no means a subsidiary sort of topic here. But before I do that, are there any questions? Anybody here? Yes?
Yeah, I do. Like all these theorems or graphs that we see, is that like a mathematical thing that we're doing, or is it legitimate? Do we know that this occurs because of historical records, or how do we know what you're saying is true?
Well, they can be measured. So like if we're trying to measure something like cost, these can be measured quite easily. And and in terms of demand, like the graphs that we've seen so far, like demand and supply, they can be measured. Demand estimation is a real thing. And some of this is, I don't get into some of the tall weeds of this because some of this comes up later if you do like a degree in econ, or there's a practice known as econometrics, which is basically the statistical means by which we collect data to plot demand curves. And so we can see what's happening with demand curves. And so when we talk about demand curves doing things like steepening or flattening, we can tell that because of estimation, because of measurement. There are some things that are a little bit more abstract, and we're going to get into. And when it is abstract, and when it's purely hypothetical, like I'm getting ready to get into here, we'll say it's hypothetical, but it's not that it's not real, it's just difficult to measure. But so far, the graphs that we've done, yes, they've got mathematical backing. They're not particularly hypothetical at all. And that's really what has taken economics from something that was sort of ephemeral and mostly philosophical, tied in very closely to political science at one point, to make it much more of a social science, and probably the most quantitative of the social sciences. Does that answer your question?
I mean, kind of, just because like we just had like all these like economic crises,
right?
Many of them lifetime economic, as if like they don't know what they're doing.
Well, it isn't economists who don't know what they're doing, because a lot of economists predicted that we'd have this issue with housing and the mortgage business being completely out of control. And it was, if anything, and don't take my word for it, Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, after he retired, wrote a big, gigantic book about how, it was mostly autobiographical, but he got into the issue of the fact that they really relied upon the financial markets to police themselves with deregulation, and they pretty much took their word that they knew what they were doing. And in terms of they did not know what they were doing. Now, it was a failure of regulation. Left to the own, and we're going to make this case again and again, that if we talk about crisis, sometimes crisis happens because of things we can't foresee, like the pandemic. I don't think anybody really foresaw the pandemic, but maybe a few people who, probably were considered to be alarmists and outliers and all that. Things happen that we just don't expect to happen, at wars and pandemics and disease and floods and earthquakes and all that. But things that are all that coming. I certainly did. I was working in banking when the thing was getting going, and I thought it was very, very dangerous. And I didn't want our bank to go anywhere near some of the crazy loans that were being made. They frankly were, where people could walk in with no down payment and declare their own income. And we saw people who said they were school bus drivers earning $90,000 a year. And that was 20 years ago. I don't think you could make that today, let alone 20 years ago. And then buying a $350,000 house. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think that in a lot of ways, I think that it's the failure of regulation. We're going to come back to regulation again and again, because it's sort of the way I sort of view it is it's kind of like on a football field. If you had no or basketball court or whatever, if you had no officials on the court or on the field, it would be just complete chaos. And the rules. So does that more or less address what your concerns are with regard to the subject?
I mean, it's kind of just big, or like the .com collapse and stuff.
Well, we do, and some of this is probably more geared toward macro. And when we get into, if you ever take macro, we do get into that a bit, where we get these excesses. And in fact, I talk, some in the online courses, we get into this a little bit more when we get sort of dialogue in discussion activities, where we talk about things like manias. And it's more of a macro topic, frankly, where markets get out of whack and people, do things that they know they shouldn't be doing, but they got to get in on the action before the action dries up. And that's what the .com bubble was. And there are a lot of other examples throughout time, no question about it. Even the stock market collapse in the early 1930s, late 20s, early 30s was just a complete chaos and lack of regulation. And so whenever there are imbalances, we see these things happen. So, okay. So any other questions before we get started? Let me see if anybody has made any comments in the chat room. Let me see here. I don't see any yet. And feel free to make a note to answer any questions from that. I don't get over there at some different place that I'll be in the room, but nonetheless, feel free to do that. So before we get into chapter 6, I want to cover one thing, and I'd like everybody to sort of take this to heart here and sort of hit save into your memory banks. And that is, there are three types of values in economics, okay? And I'm not necessarily dollars or units, or they could be dollars, they could be units, they could be percentages even, but instead they're the way that we sort of enumerate things in economics, and they are totals, averages, and marginals. Totals, averages, and marginals. And I bring this up now because we're going to be getting into talking about all of these today, and we'll get into some examples if we have time, and I'll give you some mathematical examples as to how these things work. And some of this will be a bit hypothetical, but it does tie into the demand function, because we're talking here in this chapter about household economics, and that is the role of households as consumers. This is different than, remember, we talked about the circular flow model some time ago. We talked about this idea of different roles being played. So like if you work 9 to 5, from 9 to 5, you're an employee, that's your role in the economy. And then the second you punch out at 5 o'clock, you may become a consumer. And so you're the same person, but you're doing a different function. One, you're on the supply side if you're a worker. And then two, you're on the demand side if you are a consumer. And so we play different roles, and we're going to focus on that latter role, that role of households as consumers. Also, I want to talk about, make clear that we're talking primarily here about households and not firms or governments, because those other two actor groups in that circular flow can become demanders of goods and services, but we're not really focusing on so much on them. We're focusing mostly on the household. And I think one of it's sort of unfortunate that we don't really have the time to get more into the household as opposed to firms. And I suspect it's because of the fact that we provide a lot of the background for business school education. So we probably focus more on businesses. And so it ties in directly to a lot of the accounting and financial topics that people will cover for those who are studying business. Not everyone is, but many are. So let's talk about these three types of values. We're going to come across these again and again and again, and they're different because they represent different things. Totals are what we call aggregates. Aggregates are simply collections of data. If we took everybody in this room and we added up our ages, we'd get some aggregate age of, I don't know, 230 or whatever the number is, or 180. Now, it may mean something, it may mean nothing, right? I don't know that adding up our ages really means anything. If we had everyone on a Zoom call, I mean, up to 320 years of total aggregate age. That might not mean anything. By the way, sometimes it doesn't. And how many times have you seen ads for law firms and auto mechanics where it's like, we have a combined 200 years experience? It's like, well, you don't really have 200 years experience in practicing law because it's paid for. I mean, it's 10 people who've been, working for 20 years. That doesn't mean 200 years. And by the way, those years overlap with each other anyway. So that is a meaningless estimate. And so when you hear something like we have a combined, it doesn't mean anything, right? And just like adding up our ages, what does that mean? It doesn't really tell us anything at all. However, when we talk about averages, that might mean something if we want to talk about the average length of time that a lawyer has worked in a law firm. That is probably meaningful. Or the average age of the people in this room. I don't know if it's terribly meaningful, but maybe it is if we're selling life insurance to everybody here. I think maybe we'd want to know, is this the group that we want to go to? You want to go to a nursing home to sell life insurance? Probably not, right? But we want to go to a college campus? Maybe, if you get buyers there. So here we're talking about what we call mean values. And mean, it doesn't mean mean like, mean football player or whatever, but we're talking about, the mathematical term of average, which is mean. And there are different kinds of means, or this form that we call an arithmetic mean. That's simply taking a collection of data and adding up the values, whatever they are, the dollars or units or wages or whatever, and divided by the number of observations. Okay, that's the most obvious. We all sort of know that, right? So if we took the average age of the people in this room, we add them up, we get 200 years divided by 6 or whatever, we end up with some value for the mean age, okay? Now this is different than the geometric mean where we put greater values on certain observations as opposed to other observations. Maybe we would do that for more recent data, okay? Maybe more recent data that we're collecting, it's a higher weight, okay? We're not getting into that. So if you come across that, and I bring this up because I know a lot of our students, and I sort of encourage this, but also give you a bit of caution that since, look at some of the resources on the internet and you'll get into some topics that are a little bit beyond where we're trying to go in this course. And that is this idea of weighting. We're not really going to be doing that here. We're just taking the most basic idea of mean values, okay? And then finally, we have marginals, okay? And this is, if anything, this is maybe the most important for what we're doing in microeconomics, and this is what we call incrementals. And that is, say this is maybe the most interesting and most useful value, and it's really what we're going to be talking a lot about today with regard to our discussion of utility, because when we talk about incrementals, we're talking about going from one level to the next level to the next level, whether it's up or down, and what does that mean, and what are the implications of it? And the idea is based upon the fact that rarely do you start from zero and go to, some far out value whenever you're dealing with some sort of decision in economics. Even in your own life, if you're doing something like, a budget for your household, right? You're probably not going to say, okay, well, let's plan it out. If my income next year is zero, this is what it's going to be. Or if it's $1 million, right? Now, if you earn $1 million next year, great, more power to you, good on you if that's the case. Most people don't earn $1 million, and most people don't earn zero. So maybe your income is going to be, I don't know, 25,000, 20,000, whatever it is. And so from there, you have to make a step up or step back depending upon what your income is. So you're focusing on a limited range and then the changes within that range. That's really the sweet spot. That's really what we're talking about here when we're talking about a lot of economic analysis, is focusing on where we are now versus where we're going. And it kind of goes back to something that I have said before, probably in this class, and that is, what are we even doing here? What are we studying economics for if it's not to study economic problems? Just like, why study dentistry? I mean, personally, I wouldn't want to study dentistry, but I'm glad somebody does study dentistry so that they can solve dental problems, right? That's the whole purpose of what we're doing here with economics, is we're studying it so that we can solve problems. And in fact, I think that the evidence is clear that we've solved lots of economic problems by dealing with this and by really breaking into this and studying these. Okay, so questions about that? Totals, averages, and margins. Totals are pretty simple. There's no difficulty there. Averages are, I think we are even used to that idea, but this may be a little one that's not quite as much in our own wheelhouse from a day-to-day basis. And so, but it's important, and we'll be dealing with a lot. Also, one final thing before I move on to utility, and that is there are some problems with averages, and we're going to get to what those problems are. And that is, and one of those, just to give you a bit of as to where we might be going a bit later, is the fact that averages can sometimes be misleading. Because sometimes you have outlying values, right? And the outlying value can push the average to a point where it's unrecognizable. And so as a result, what good is the average, right? And one example I gave is, let's say that a church is trying to levy an expected contribution from every household that belongs to the church. And so they'll take an average income and they'll say, okay, then the average income of the household is this, and so this is what you should contribute. But then suddenly a new parishioner joins the church and it's a billionaire, right? It's Elon Musk, it's Bill Gates. And suddenly the average is just shot all out of the place because now the expected contribution is beyond people's incomes because this gigantic amount of income, right? So that's an example. That's an example of that. So sometimes what do you have to do with outlying values usually? Anybody? What do you have to do with them?
Throw them out.
Throw them out. You got to get rid of them. You have to get rid of them because they are a distraction and they're irrelevant, and so you have to throw them out. So wild and crazy values that don't seem to fit have to be tossed because they're outliers. And so that's really essentially what's going on. So that is a problem with average. And so I want to make clear that none of these are really problem-free, which is why we have to take them really in combination, which is what we're going to do. So we're talking about the economics of the household. So any questions before we get into talking about households and what they are up to in terms of after 5 o'clock or whatever the after work period is? Well, we're going to say that households, in fact, all actors are engaged in what we call maximizing behavior. Maximizing behavior. And this thing I'm going to return to again and again. And we're going to say that as rational economic actors, that we're trying to do certain things. And one of those as consumers is to maximize our utility and consumption. Now, utility sounds like kind of a wonky term. It's not particularly useful. It's not really everyday speech. And yet it sort of has worked its way into the lexicon of economists. Instead, what's better is benefit. I think that's probably better. In fact, the word utility, we ask people what utility means, they would talk about P&M or New Mexico gas. And so, and by the way, we will talk about utilities and their special role in the economy, which is not to be confused with this at all. This is the households and their role as consumers. So we're talking about the usefulness or satisfaction or benefit that buyers derive from consumption. If you didn't get benefit from consuming a bottle of water or a hamburger or detergent or shampoo or shoes, then why buy them in the first place? And so you have to get some sort of benefit from them. Now, here's the thing, and we're going to start with a very hypothetical unit, which doesn't really exist. You won't see it listed on a financial statement or anywhere, a hypothetical value called utils. And this is where, and again, as I mentioned at the outset, it was a pretty good question that was asked as to whether or not all this is real or is this hypothetical. And there are some times in which we do with hypothetical units, but we know they're hypothetical and we'll say they're hypothetical, but just because they're hypothetical doesn't mean they're real. It just means they're sort of ephemeral and that we have to take the analysis a little bit further. And the case we're going to make is that the utility function is directly tied into the demand function. Like that's where the demand curve comes from, is this idea of utility. And it's one thing for us to be able to derive a demand curve from observation. Remember, when we got into chapter 3, I said, okay, here's a demand curve. And how do economists come up with a demand curve? We said that they plot data based upon studies and observation, using a lot of different tools, most of which we're not really going to get into, but they can take statistical price studies. They can do marketing research. They can do promotional plans, offer 2-for-1 or offer special packages to find out what that demand curve looks like, particularly if it's changing over time. It's shifting to the right, shifting to the left and whatnot. But that's just observation. That's just the what. This is the how. This is why. I guess the how and the why as to where utility comes from. And that is the idea that buyers derive value from the consumption of goods, and therefore that's what they're up to. So, and as to this idea of maximizing behavior, we're also going to focus on this a bit later in the sense that all economic actors are going to engage in maximizing behavior. And that's a little bit beyond where I want to go with that particular topic right now, but we will return to it. So one topic before we get into this is marginal utility. So we talked about the term marginal as being incremental. Those as they go from one level to the next. So if your income is 20,000 this year and it goes to 22,000 next year, that's an incremental change. If it goes to 26,000 the next year, that's an incremental change of 4,000 over 22,000, et cetera. Well, when it comes to utility, maybe I drink 4 Cokes a week, and then maybe I'm drinking too many Cokes. And I want to dial it down now to 3 Cokes a week. That's an incremental change of 1. But then we're talking about what is the benefit to me as I do that. And in other words, what we're saying is the change in the total. Remember, these 3 values in economics that I talked about at the outset are important because they interrelate to one another. They tie into one another. Any kind of marginal anything, marginal utility, which sometimes is called marginal benefit. But the problem with marginal benefit is that a marginal benefit can be applied to any actor, even government or business firms certainly can have marginal benefit. But when we talk about marginal utility, we are focusing specifically on consumption of goods. So marginal anything is the change in that thing in the total divided by the change in whatever the activity is. And so marginal utility, which we call MU, is the change in total utility divided by the quantity. The quantity here is the quantity consumed. It's the quantity consumed. Okay, so that's an important thing for us to realize is the total utility divided by the change in total utility divided by the quantity consumed. And the things to know, whenever you're talking about a marginal, sort of the big tip off as to the fact that we're talking about a marginal are these delta symbols because, and there's a reason why we got into talking about these early on in the course, particularly with the discussion of the math piece in the appendix A, is because we're talking about some change in something. But don't be afraid of it because all it is new minus old. New minus old, that's all it is simply taking the new value of total utility, which itself is a little bit difficult to arrive at. It's theoretical. And by the way, people get different amounts of utility from goods. There's some people who don't like to drink Cokes at all, right? And so as a result, that they get 0 utility. Some people don't get any benefit or utility from smoking cigarettes. Some do. Some get a great amount. So this is individualized. And then what we're doing is then we collect all these together to arrive at demand for the good. If people get utility at all, then they are on the demand side for that good. People who get no utility from drinking Cokes or Pepsis or whatever don't fall into the demand side because they're not consuming it theoretically, right? Or non-smokers are not in the demand curve. So it makes no difference to you what the price of cigarettes is if you're a non-smoker because you get no utility at all. Okay, and we'll get into the dollar figures on this before we leave, hopefully today. So it's the change in this divided by the change in that. How many more units of Coke or cigarettes or whatever am I consuming during the day that gives me this marginal change, okay? So let's take a little bit of time here and focus in on what some of these are going to look like. And I'm going to sort of talk about this idea of what we call articulation, which don't write that down, but what we're simply saying is it's the way that one variable interacts with another. In other words, how does it react? How does it communicate? And what does it mean for all of us? And so what I'm going to do is we're going to talk a bit about what this does look like. And so I'm going to come over here and I'm going to sort of give you a bit of backwards on this thing here. I've got to keep remembering that everything goes backwards with this camera here. And we don't have the handheld. It's the opposite than the handheld one that somebody walked off with some time ago. So, okay. So, questions so far before we get into talking about these functions here. Okay. So let's talk about this idea of utility. Now, I said that we are going to start with a very generic concept of something called utils. And so we're going to put utils on this vertical axis here. Okay. This is the axis that we've seen before, this kind of thing. Okay. And what are we really talking about here when we talk about the horizontal? We're talking about the quantity. And by the way, the quantity here, I want to be clear here, the quantity Q equals Q, okay? Because I feel like it's important for us to note that we're not talking about the quantity produced, we're only talking about the consumption side of things here, quantity consumed. Because the Q that we've come across before is what? Is is the quantity exchanged in a market. So here we need to specify what that is. So I'm even going to call that Q sub C for quantity consumed, okay? And we're going to keep the same value here of utils in both axes. And so what have we got going on here? One of the things that we can say about utility is that whatever the good in question is that we get a certain amount of benefit from that good. And as the more we consume of that good, we get more benefit, but it tails off over time. And so the total utility curve looks something like that. It gains some steam and it sort of begins to fall off at a period of time. And think about why this is the case. And again, there's also, as one of my colleagues had said, there's sort of a reset button also on this particular thing. So, and, once we start consuming more of something, we get a little bit tired of it. And we need to kind of move on and find something different happening. So when we talk about this, what we're really saying is that this begins to tail off. One example that I gave, that I've heard for years and years and years, even from the time when I was an undergraduate, was glasses of beer. That was always the example. That kind of tells you where my professors' heads were, I guess, right? And they were saying that, okay, you can drink beer and it gives you a lot of satisfaction. That's great. Drink another beer. Good. After what, 7 or 8 or 9 glasses of beer, whatever the number is, I guess we're all different. My beer drinking days are long over, but then it begins to really be not so good. In fact, in other words, what's going on here is that this marginal function sort of declines. It's a diminishing function. And this is the thing that we want to know about, is that utility in general is the first of a series of functions that we're going to be getting into this course that we call a diminishing function. A diminishing function. In other words, it's going to be downward sloping, that as we get less and less benefit as we go this direction. So as we consume more of something, we get less and less benefit. And we are, I think, sort of familiar with this in our own lives. Well, you can take the glass of beer example if you like and go with that glass or glasses of beer, or cups of coffee or whatever. I like the cups of coffee one myself because, the first cup of coffee I have during the day is pretty darn good. I don't know about you. If you drink coffee at all. Now, if you don't drink coffee at all, you get zero utility, and so we're not even talking about you, right? Okay, but if you do drink coffee, the first cup of coffee is pretty good, right? Second cup is pretty good, not as good. Third cup, okay. Fourth cup, all right, yeah, maybe I want it, maybe I don't. 19th cup, and I'm psychotic, right? In fact, utility can actually become negative. We can actually go below this horizontal axis. You can get negative utility, right? It is very possible to get negative utility from the consumption of anything, because if you simply overdo it. The idea is not to overdo it. And so we're going to be sort of illustrating sort of graphically this sort of sweet spot where if we're engaging in maximized behavior, that's not maximizing anything if you're drinking 19 cups of coffee a day, right? Obviously, that's an example. I don't know if I've ever come across anybody who ate or who's drank 19 cups of coffee. I was in a taco eating contest once in college, and the guy that won ate 24 tacos. And talk about negative utility. And well, anyway, let's not get into that. So anyway, utility is the first of what we call a diminishing function. This is not going to be the last. Diminishing functions, and we're sort of familiar with these too. We're familiar with diminishing functions because we sort of hear this in everyday life. This is sort of a household term. You've all heard the term diminishing returns before, right? Where you're getting less and less back the more you put into something, and so as a result, it's not really paying off for you, and you got to sort of dial it down. For instance, if you go to the doctor for your physical, and the doctor says you're in terrible shape, your blood pressure's high, you need to lose 20 pounds, whatever, start going to the gym. So let's say you go to the gym and you work out an hour a day, right? That's pretty good, right? Then you say, hey, if an hour a day is good, why not do 2 hours? Okay, that's okay, but you're not getting 4 hours. Well, you're probably beginning to overdo it. And by the way, the incremental benefits are getting less and less and less. That would be an example of that, right? Where you're not really getting that much more benefit. If you do 8 hours a day in the gym, maybe you're going to hurt something. You're going to pull something or whatever. We all know this idea of what are called diminishing returns, only we'll add a bit of modification to it by saying, economists would call that diminishing marginal returns. It's not that you're getting zero returns, you're just getting less and less return back, in essence, for doing whatever it is you're doing, right? By the way, there is sort of in everyday speech, people talk about this idea of the definition of insanity, which, by the way, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But what do people say is the definition of insanity, whether you like it or not, right? It's doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for different results, right? And again, that's not to be taken scientific, and I'm not a mental health expert by any stretch. But it's kind of the idea of if the more you do something, the less and less back you get. Why should we do it? And so as a result, you're getting less and less incremental benefit back from doing it. So maybe you should quit doing it. Because I think that's one of the things we should talk about is the idea that you're getting less and less benefit back. Okay? So questions about that? So this is how these functions work together with each other. There's a fall off. There's a loss of benefit. Now, by the way, when I talked about this reset button, maybe next week, next year, whatever whenever the appropriate time frame is, this whole thing resets itself. And so as a result, you're starting over. And by the way, this is individual. This is individual to somebody. If you're working out at the gym, maybe, and somebody else is not, then they're not being measured here, okay? But it's just like demand in general. If you're not doing something, then you're not consuming some activity, then you're not really being measured, okay? And so as a result, that's the thing that we should be aware of, okay? All right, so questions about that. And then I want to talk a bit about why utilities is diminishing. And so let me get this up on the screen here, and we will talk about why the theory is that utility is a diminishing function. Give me a second. This camera is extremely slow here. So, okay. All right. So why is utility diminishing? Why is it diminishing? I hope everyone can see that. And I guess I could drop the lights a bit on that so we can see that a little bit better. But let's talk about why, and spend some time talking about why it's the case, because I think this is important for us to really understand why it's diminishing. Well, first of all, one which probably, I don't know, maybe doesn't even require that much discussion is the idea that additional amounts of some good at some point will be enough. And that is the idea that over time, we're going to get that enough is enough, right? So we're not going to get that much additional benefit from consuming the good. So as a result, our utility is going to diminish. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Sometimes we're satisfied and we're done. Remember the definition here of what this is. If you don't like the word utility, then just simply think of it as satisfaction or benefit from consuming a good. And if we're not getting any benefit from it, then why do we do it, right? And that explains a lot of consumer behaviors. They individually get some sort of benefit from doing it, right? And so you'll do it because you get some benefit. Okay, so what about this idea of consuming goods then? So that's the first. And the second one is a little bit more wonky. So, and we're going to get into this a bit later. That's the idea. It relates to substitutes, okay? So you thought we were done with talking about substitutes, and we're not, because this is something that is important in understanding demand. And that is the idea that people can swap out. They can go to some other good and choose something different. Same good at all. In fact, it may be something completely different, some sort of different activity, right? And it relates to the ability to get substitutes in the first place. And then each buyer is available what we call consumption bundle. Let's define what the term consumption bundle is. The term consumption bundle is simply unique to every individual, and it's every individual's unique collection of goods that they routinely consume. Each individual's routine consumption of goods, and most of us have that. And why do we feel comfortable talking about this idea of consumption bundle as though it's, as though we think we've got it sort of figured out, right? That, that people behave the way they behave because they're predictable. Well, we say it because they pretty much are predictable, right? And so, and I think most of us individually probably pretty much are, right? I mean, I think most of us, like if we go to the store, we buy the same goods over and over again, right? And we sort of know what we're doing, and it doesn't vary much. It really does not. And by the way, this is, when we talk about the demand curve, it's almost, or the demand side of the market, it's almost impossible not to link that back to the supply side and say that who is very interested in these relationships? Maybe not the consumers themselves, maybe it's the supply side. I think that's really the case. the supply side really wants to understand what is in the minds of the buyer. Because if you know what they're thinking and they're feeling and what their desires are, what their attempt to maximize is, then I think you could probably better serve that particular market. Okay, and I think that's a very important part of where we're going here in this course. Is we're going to talk a lot about the supply side and having to understand the demand side in a way that the demand side does not have a similar burden to do. So consumption bundle. So think about this. You're just an ordinary person and you go to the store and you buy Glad trash bags and Folgers coffee and, Eckrich bologna. I mean, it's your behavior, you're almost like an automaton in some cases, walking around picking in. This is why branding is so powerful, right? This is why because it's a shortcut for us to buy a good that we know what to get. Again, when we get to this a bit later in the course, we're going to talk about brands and what brands do for us. And let me just ask you real briefly here, for those of you here, why do brands even exist in the first place? I'm not talking about from the supply side. I'm talking about why we benefit from brands. Why are they there? And more importantly, why do you benefit from the brand? And I don't think anybody here can say that they don't focus on a particular brand of something, right? So why do you do that? What is it you're getting out of it? Well, it could be lower. It could be lower prices, but it could also be higher prices. In fact, that's something we do see happening from time to time, particularly if you compare the brand against the generic. Quality? Quality. Okay, quality I think is probably, and what about the quality I think is important to know? Because maybe it's not even a very good in the first place. It's consistency, it's consistent quality. We know exactly what we're getting. We know exactly what we're getting with the brand. It could be a price issue, but it could be a quality issue, but we know exactly what we're getting when we buy a good. When's the last time you bought a Big Mac and thought, wow, this Big Mac is a lot different than the Big Mac that I had last week? Never. I mean, it just doesn't really happen. So we know what we're getting. And so as a result, this is why we behave in these sorts of automatic ways, is because we sort of understand what it is we're trying to get out of it. And even if we're willing to pay a little bit more, and sometimes brands do cost more. In fact, a lot of times they do. And we're going to make the case a bit later too, as we get into the economics of firms, that the stronger the brand means the stronger the pricing, and the stronger the attachment of the demand side to the good. And I was talking to my class, one of my classes yesterday, about the fact that, and I'll probably, unfortunately, I sometimes repeat myself because I don't know what I told what class what, but I had a student years ago who was talking about substitutes. I was talking about motorcycles for whatever reason. I said that, there are sometimes brand substitutes for motorcycles that you can, Harley Davidson and Honda and whatnot. And he immediately corrected me and said, there is no substitute for Harley Davidson, right? And I said, well, yes, there actually are. Of course, I gave him sort of the wonky professorial answer. He goes, there is no substitute for Harley Davidson. So he was obviously sold in, I would presume, brand loyal to that particular product. And so you get the idea. Sometimes people get fanatical about brands. And we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. But if we focus on this idea of consumption bundle, that is the routine number of goods. And by the way, we can switch brands. And a lot of times we choose substitutes based on price. That's going to be an important issue. And we're going to focus on that a bit later. Sometimes there are no substitutes, so the price becomes, a little bit less of a discussion. There's not much to do about it if you want that good. But where there are, and where the substitute goods are relatively swappable, if that's the word, then the price becomes all important. Okay. So what about this consumption bundle? If you've got a very broad consumption bundle, you've got a steeper slope of your marginal utility curve generally. Okay. What does this mean? A broad consumption bundle. That means you've got lots and lots and lots and lots of choices. Okay. That's what a broad consumption bundle means. It means that you can quickly move on to some other kind of good if you lose interest or utility in doing something. In other words, you've got choices and you can do other things, right? And so you're very steep. So in other words, your quantity, right? I wish I could swivel the camera. If it's very steep, your quantity goes down very, very quickly, and you don't really consume a lot of it because you've got other choices. And what really dictates whether or not you have a broad consumption bundle? Well, one, you need to live in an area and be in an environment where you've got lots and lots of choices, but also as a function of income. More income, you've got a broader consumption bundle by definition, right? You've got more choices because you've got more income in order to spend, and more choices generally depending upon all kinds of conditions, the economy generally, where you are in your own particular existence and whatnot. And I bring this up because we'll talk about the narrow consumption bundle. So if you have a narrow consumption, you have a flatter slope, you get almost the same amount of utility because you really don't have any other substitutes. You're sort of locked in. Maybe your income is relatively low, and you don't have a lot of choices. And by the way, one group of consumers that is very much fitting this definition of narrow consumption bundle is children. Okay? I don't know if anybody here has children, but I can tell you that what is one behavior that children do that's almost unique to them, and that is they do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. I can't tell you the number of times my son will put on the movie Sonic the Hedgehog. That and Sonic the Hedgehog too, again and again and again and again and again. I've seen the movie so many times I can tell you what the next line is going to be. I mean, that's how many times I've seen it. This is a unique behavior to children because they don't have a lot of choices. You can't go out and get on a motorcycle and go for a ride. You can't go get on a plane. You can't go to the casino, right? He's small. You can't go run around the neighborhood. You can't go to a bar. You can't go to the movies by himself. I mean, so you get the idea. It's a narrow consumption bundle. So I bring this up as an example. And it's not just children. Even people living in countries that are very, very poor, they don't have a lot of choices. Or countries in which the government has really controlled the economy to the point where it doesn't really allow for much consumer goods. Soviet Union, North Korea, there just aren't a lot of choices. And so as a result, you're just going to keep consuming, however much you're able to do because you don't have a lot of choices. Substitutes are important, and the broadness or the narrowness of your consumption bundle is really related to that, okay? And then sort of tied into this is something I just sort of alluded to a second ago, and that's the idea of scarcity, okay? Less scarce goods, steeper slope of the marginal utility curve. Okay, so if there's lots of availability, then you can move on. This is sort of related, I guess, to consumption bundle in a way, but it really relates to outside of the consumer himself or herself. And that's the idea that if not very much scarcity, then you can move on, and you're going to be steep because you can simply just jump out of that particular good and go to something else. You can hop out of that and go on to something different. Okay, if there's a lack of scarcity. And one example I gave, and this is something that hit home for me, is my brother and sister-in-law spent some time in the Middle East, about a year and a half, doing research. It was a sabbatical thing for both of them, and they noticed that there were goods were a lot scarcer in parts of the world. When they came back, they noticed they were sort of reminded about the lack of scarcity that the U.S. has relative to others. That he said, all these different kinds of apples, Gala apples and Jonathan apples and Red Delicious, all these different kinds of apples. It's like, you're lucky if you see apples at all in certain markets, but all these different varieties, different kinds of tomatoes and different sizes of shampoos and ketchup and all these kinds of things. And so as a result, you can just simply choose, right? And you get choices. Maybe I don't want to buy tomatoes. Maybe I want to buy this, right? But when there's scarcity, you're going to have a flatter slope. It is by definition the definition of a narrow consumption bundle. When goods are scarce, you've got to make do with what you've got. And so as a result, you're going to stick with it. And your utility is going to be however much utility you can get out of it, even though it's not really, maybe it's not diminishing very much, but you're going to sort of stick with it because there's no real choice about it. Okay? All right. So questions for me about any of this? Anybody on the Zoom call want to unmute and say something? Feel free to. It's a small enough group, we can do that. Okay, well, what I want to do is this. I want to give an example here where, again, utility itself is not so much useful, and it's not terribly useful until we start putting numbers and dollars to it. But before we do that, though, I just want to sort of give a bit of I give you a graph. The graph is just one thing, right? And it maybe it's not the most, user-friendly sort of way to present it. So let's just sort of present some examples of how this works, particularly when we're trying to choose goods which are different than one another. And the goods that I'm going to be illustrating here are pizza and concerts, okay? Pizza and concerts. These are not the same good at all, okay? But we're going to sort of lay out for an example of how total utility works and its interplay to marginal utility, okay? So let me see if I get this right here. And So I'll try to get out of the way here as much as I'm able to do. But so we got two goods, and let's say these are the only two goods in your consumption bundle, okay? And I realize the problematic nature of doing that because it kind of brings us back to the example that we talked about some time ago with regard to the production possibilities model, where we said we've only got two goods being produced in the economy, guns and butter, or good A, good B, whatever. And we said, look, we know that it's a simplified example, but it's a model. That's what models seek to do, is to sort of simplify the analysis. But it doesn't mean that they're not real. And I wish we had a little bit more room on this board here because I'm going to I'm afraid this is going to be a bit messy. And so I'll do the best I can, especially with the pizza example. So maybe if it gets too low at the end, maybe you'll get the drift without me having to get two people in. So let's take at 0 units, and we'll bring in the dollars a bit later. Let's not worry about that so much yet. At 0 units of consumption, both of these goods, the only two goods in our consumption bundle, pizza and concerts, and forget it right now about the fact that these are two ridiculous examples, but it's just for modeling purposes. Let's say that if we consume one pizza per week, we get 50 units of utility. It goes to 90. In other words, it's an increase. We're still gaining utility, okay? And then 3 units, we get 122 and 150. And all these are examples of utility, okay? All these are examples of utility. 176, 200, and 222, et cetera. So I think I'm going to stop there just because I think you'll probably get the point without me going too much further. And then we get a different set of utility with concerts. Maybe we get more utility from going to a concert than we do from ordering a pizza, right? So we get 75 units in the first concert we go, and then we go to a second concert in a week or a month or whatever this time frame happens to be. And then we go and we get some more, and it goes up and up and up and up as we go more to concerts, okay? All right. So that is what it is. And it sort of gives us an idea of the fact that utility is rising as we consume more of these individual goods in this two good consumption bundle. But we're really interested more in this idea of marginal utility. And the marginal utility is basically this. It's the change in total utility divided by the change in quantity. And it's the quantity consumed. And what is that change in utility? It's simply marginal utility, right? That's what marginal utility really is. And it's the change in utility. It's basically new minus old, TU2 minus TU1 over quantity consumed 1. I'm sorry, 2 minus 1. This is really, I'm not really getting this in here, am I? Minus quantity consumed 1. That's, I'm sort of jamming that in there, but I don't really have much board space. I apologize. So let me just put it down here, then I'll go ahead and erase this here. It's total utility from 1. It's new minus old, right? That's TU1. Quantity consumed 2 minus quantity consumed 1. Okay, that's a little bit easier to see. I'm going to have to erase that because I'm going to need that column, but that's really what's going on. Again, don't be afraid of the delta symbol. All it means is change. And as we go up, it's going to be 3 minus 2. It's going to be 4 minus 3, 5 minus 4, etc. As we do what? As we go from one incremental level to the next. That's what marginals are, which is why we call them incrementals. As we go from one unit to the next, this is the amount of utility that we're getting. At least hypothetically, because again, utils are hypothetical. But because they're hypothetical doesn't mean that they're not somehow real. And what makes them even more difficult is the fact that not everybody gets the same amount of utility, right? There are people who don't like pizza at all. I've got my wife's aunt who lives with us, doesn't like pizza. So whenever we order pizza, we've got to get her a turkey sandwich, right? Or something because she doesn't like pizza. So she gets zero utility, right? So we're only accounting for people who get utility from the good. And by the way, what if you really, really like pizza a lot? Then maybe your utility is higher to begin with, and maybe it diminishes a little bit slower time because you really, you get lots and lots of utility, okay? So we are really talking about individuals, but the thing about it is, we put all these individuals together, and in the demand side, we end up getting demand for a good. This is where this comes from. By the way, what does that look like, that downward sloping curve? It looks like a demand curve, doesn't it? And you got quantity on the horizontal axis, you've got some valuation figure on the vertical axis. Well, that looks like a demand curve. In fact, the marginal utility curve is the beginning, the derivation of the demand curve. It's just another way of getting to it, because at first, when we presented the demand curve, we simply said, this is what we observe But now we're trying to get into why is it the case? We observe it, but why, right? Because I think we always have to know the why something happens. Until we know that, we don't really get it, okay? All right, so as we go from 0 to 1, the marginal utility is 50, right? As we go from 1 to 2 units, it's 40. That's, in other words, 50 minus 0 is 50, and the change in the quantity is going to be 1 every time. That makes the numerator or the denominator pretty easy, since the denominator is going to be 1 in every case. That makes it easy peasy, right? From 2 to 3, it's 32. From 3 to 4, it's 28. And it goes to 26. And hopefully everybody can see what I'm doing. By the way, we usually set these at like a half step, right? This is why we sort of use these bright. We set these at a half step because it's as we go from 0 to 1, as we go from 1 to 2, as we go. So that's why a lot of times you'll see marginals set at the half step as the interval. We're getting incremental benefit as we go throughout time. And the same goes over here with concerts. From 0 to 1 unit, we get 75 units of marginal utility. From 1 to 2, I'm going to my glasses here. From 1 to 2, we get 48 units, and what was that? 36 and 24 and 22. So what can we say immediately right off the bat here about what's happening? Is marginal utility is going down, 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 right? In other words, we're getting diminishing amounts of marginal utility as we consume more of these goods. Either one of these goods, because either one of these goods basically has utility. If it didn't have utility, we wouldn't demand them at all. But because they've got some utility, some positive amount of utility, we get some benefit. It's just the marginal benefit goes down. And this goes to this idea that we talked about before, that any kind of a good that you consume more and more of, particularly if you have choices and you have substitutes available and you've got something of a broad consumption bundle, then you can either quickly or slowly lose interest in a particular good as your marginal utility is changing. But one thing that we are pretty certain of is that marginal utility is a diminishing function. So whatever it is, that example of the glasses of beer, the one that we heard a lot about, at least I heard a lot about for a long time, was this idea of trying to explain why people do what they do. And the fact is, you can frankly consume more of this and then get to a negative condition. And by the way, I think that we're going to sort of make the case that there is some sort of balance that it can be achieved. And we're also going to make the case that a broader consumption bundle is a good thing, as opposed to a bad thing, particularly if you believe in the benefit or the value of trying to maximize behavior. And in other words, maximize behavior is that which is related to trying to get the most out of what you've got, okay? All right, so questions about that. And for those of you who are watching on the recorded video, you can obviously stop and take a look at that. And hopefully you'll be able to see that. If not, well, hopefully you were able to see that. So, and you can copy that down. But there are examples in the text about this and whatnot. So what I want to do is talk about this other idea that, okay, well, I've been sort of alluding to the fact that the marginal utility function has got value because it ties into, it really sort of forms the basis for the demand function itself. And we're talking about here about demand of consumers, which is specifically talking once again about household consumption of goods, right? And this leads us then to what's called consumer choice theory, which really seeks to explain why consumers do what they do based upon income. So the thing we haven't really gotten into at all, we've sort of alluded to it, but we really haven't gotten into is this idea of income. Because we know that allocate their income to consumption. In other words, their consumption possibilities. Consumption possibilities. This is an important thing because up to this point, the only model that we've given where it relates to one good versus the other good was that of production possibilities. Well, now we're going to get into consumption possibilities. And this is something that is probably a little bit more our wheelhouse in terms of where we live. And that's the idea that we all take whatever income we've got from whatever source and we divide it up in terms of consumption. And I realize that, not everyone takes every dollar of income and spends it because there is savings involved. And so we have a way to account for savings as well. But I'm not going to focus so much on savings here because that's really more of a macro topic. But I do want everybody to know that there is an understanding that, yes, not everybody spends every single dollar they've got. In fact, you probably should not spend every dollar you've got if you feel like there's a need to have some sort of savings. And so But it's the way we divide this up and we make our purchases, okay? And so what does this look like when it comes to dividing these purchases up and what the benefits are of it? So let's, whoa, I just zoomed out here. Let me zoom back in on the camera. And I know that those of you in the room don't know what I'm seeing here, but I kind of went crazy with the camera. So let's do this. Let's talk a bit about this idea of consumption possibilities. And let's talk about this idea of how we create the consumption possibilities curve. Okay, it's not really all that different than the production possibilities model we talked about some time ago. Okay, not really that different at all. But let's talk about where this sort of ties in here. And so let's say that we've got these same two goods here. Okay, I'm going to go and erase all this and go back to these two goods that we talked about: pizza and concerts. Okay, pizza and concerts. So let's just sort of plot a graph here, and let's say, okay, it's just like the production possibilities model, only it's goods consumed, not goods produced. And so now we've got instead of good A and good B, or guns and butter, back from the production possibilities model, we're going to be very explicit and say we have concerts on this axis, and these are numbers of concerts, right? Numbers, right? Just like in the case of production possibilities, numbers, and then pizza in terms of numbers. These are quantities, right? These are quantities of pizzas and quantities of concerts. Okay, and so what have we got going on here in terms of this sort of thing laid out here? We've got a curve that looks something like this. Well, we know it's going to be downward sloping, like something like that. And it's going to be linear, and there's a reason why without getting into, because remember with the production possibilities model, it was bowed like this. It was a curve. It was concave downward. And there was a reason for that, and it was the idea of the adaptability of inputs. And some of it was a little bit beyond where we wanted to go in this class. One of the things we said about production possibilities is because it was bowed, the slope changed as you get closer to the axes. It got more vertical as it approached the horizontal, more horizontal as it approached the vertical. Well, that doesn't occur with a straight line, because what's the mathematical relationship that's at work here with a straight line? That relationship is that it's the same slope at between any 2 points on the segment, any 2 segments, right? So you've got different possibilities here for consumption, and so let's talk about what these different possibilities are. First of all, you can consume nothing but pizzas or nothing but concerts. In other words, 10 pizzas or 0 or 5 concerts, and then 0 of the other good. Okay, and we're gonna sort of say that these are different points along this function. We're going to call that point A, and we're going to call this point F. And then we've got different points along this. We're going to call B, point C, point D, and point E. Okay? And those are just different combinations of inputs. Now, why is it a straight line? Why is it important? Because I think I should explain why. When we talked about the slope of the production possibilities, we said that it changes slope because inputs are more adaptable to change. Well, here the only input is money, right? And we're assuming that the consumer has a fixed income. Now, is that an irrational sort of expectation that the consumer has a fixed income? Not really. In fact, even though the fact is, if you're like me, you've got older relatives, and they'll often say, "Hey, I'm on a fixed income," right? Well, guess what? Most people are on what is relatively a fixed income. I mean, most people are. If you work at a job, you have a wage. Maybe your hours vary a little bit, and maybe they change over time. But they're in the very short run, which is really where we're talking about here. They don't really change. Remember, this demand. What we're talking about demand is a snapshot in time, and it's going to change over time. But for the most part, your income is relatively fixed. Yes, there are people whose incomes are wildly variable. Commission salespeople, entertainers. Their incomes are just wild and crazy. And this is why a lot of people don't like those jobs. It's because they can't count on this idea of something being fixed. If your only input is this, then the trade-off is equivalent. $1 spent in one place means $1 given up somewhere else. Exactly $1, right? $10 spent in one place is $10 given up somewhere else. So what have you got going on here? You've simply got this. Let's say that you're this, and by the way, what is this term here? This is the consumption possibilities curve, right? Consumption possibilities. But it's also got a very specific term, and in fact, I think your text gets into this. Consumption possibilities curve is one and the same as the budget line. The budget line. And the budget line basically is that limiting factor, and it's, you can think of it as a constraint, a seatbelt, whatever that hems you in from being able to spend more than what your income is. Okay? And so just to give you an example here of what we're talking about with regard to this, we've got different points of consumption that are possible here, right? And so if you've got, you know, the possibilities of A, B, C, D, and E, and F, I guess, right? And you've got in concerts, pizza in concerts, well, then you can choose anywhere from 0 here and 0 here, right? In terms of quantities, these are quantities, right? Or you can go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and this goes back in the direction 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So point A is it's simply an ordered pair of 0 and 5, right? If I consume 0 pizza, I consume 5 concerts. At point F, it's still an ordered pair. If I consume 10 pizzas, I consume 0 concerts. And everywhere along this is a trade-off. And by the way, this slope is not changing. Slope is exactly the same because you are hemmed in by your budget. And your budget is whatever the budget is, okay? Now, here's the thing that I think is important for us to realize is that, are we ever hemmed in by our budget? So whatever our budget is, and let's say that, we can give an example. Let's say that our budget is, let me see here, $100, right? And so if pizzas cost $10 and concerts $20, then it means 5 concerts times 20 is 100, 10 pizzas times 100, times 10 pizzas, $10 times 10 pizzas is $100, or we can simply allocate them in other ways. Now, is it possible? Is it possible to consume somewhere out here? Okay. Remember, with the production possibilities model, we said, okay, if we're outside the curve here, it's not possible at the present time, right? That there's something that's limiting. We can't get beyond the curve. This is a frontier. Well, here you can. What's one way that you can get to this point, even given your income, which is limited, right? We're saying it's fixed in the short run. How can you consume this figure out here? Which means more, or maybe somewhere out here, because it looks like it's somewhere out there. Why can we, how do we do that? What's one way that we can do that? Borrowing money, right. And this is one way that consumers can spend more than what they earn, is that they can borrow. And I don't want to make it sound like borrowing is in itself something irresponsible, because it's not, but it does allow consumers to get a little bit of leverage to buy goods that they can't afford at the present time. And over time, you know, they can pay off the borrowing. The borrowing cost is incorporated into their budget, and something else will have to be given up. And maybe that something is savings, because conversely, you can spend here, and whatever the difference is goes to savings, right? Borrowing is the opposite of savings. It's just the opposite, right? It's a reverse transaction. And we know this because, first of all, every time you borrow, you're actually borrowing from what? Someone else's savings somewhere. Somewhere, you're borrowing from someone else's savings. Because savings in economics, we simply define as deferred spending, right? Either I get an income and I save it, or I get an income and I spend it. If I don't spend it, then I must be saving it. And so if I go to the bank and make a deposit, a bank deposit, then they do what? They end up giving or lending it to someone who is borrowing it. They're borrowing my savings for the time being. And the bank is paying me, and they're charging them money. And so the difference is what the bank earns. But this is not, this is not earth-shattering Nobel Prize winning stuff. I mean, all I'm simply saying is you can push this envelope this way or this way. Because I don't know if anybody knows anybody who consumes very little amounts of their income. It does happen. There are people who have even modest incomes, but save an incredible amount of money because they just don't spend. Maybe it's because they just don't get much pleasure in consuming goods. Maybe they get more pleasure in saving. There are a lot of people who are just fanatical about savings. And there are people in the opposite, make a gigantic income, but really like to spend, and borrow. I mean, I as a banker, I saw highly paid doctors and lawyers who just spent money like crazy, had tons of debt, but they just like to consume. But likewise, we would see people who looked like they were, practically on their down and outs. They looked like they didn't have a dollar to their name. I had a customer walk in one time who was smoking a cigarette as he walked in the office and didn't want to put it out because he wanted to smoke it later. He thought he put it out, but instead put it in his pocket, and his jacket caught on fire. And we said, "Sir, you're on fire." And we didn't know who he was. He was a customer of another branch of our bank. And we just thought he was some unfortunate person who walked into a bank on fire, right? For one thing. So we thought, oh, he's got some real problems, Turns out the guy had $600,000 on deposit. He had many more in banks. He just was a huge saver, and he wanted that cigarette. He did not want to put that cigarette out because he wanted to smoke it later. And you get the idea. There are people who are extremely frugal, and they're somewhere here, and big spenders are out here. So we know that this exists, and we know also that there are more than two goods that are consumed. And by the way, I know that sometimes people we run into this sort of pushback from people who say, well, wait a minute, what economy produces only two goods, and what consumer only consumes two goods? Okay, well, that's a fair criticism. And if we wanted, we could take a hypothetical consumption model and we could just create graphs around the room and on the ceiling. We could do that. It is possible to do. It's a little hard to do with graphs. We could do it with computers, and that's what we do with computers. If we had a hypothetical consumption model of, I don't know, 50 goods, whatever, right? By the way, it's a function of income too. If the higher our income, the more goods are going to be in that bundle and whatnot. But what we're talking about is simply dividing up how we allocate these. And the fact of the matter is we can allocate everything to one thing or allocate more to another. And we're going to see that maybe that's not the best way to get there, because what's missing from this is this idea of marginal utility, and that's where we're going to go. One final thing, I did want to sort of get into this idea of marginal utility per dollar, because we got into marginal utility as this connection, this interplay between total and marginal. That's why I spent time at the outset talking about the difference between totals and marginals, because it's important. But we didn't bring in yet was dollars. Now we're starting to bring dollars into it. And I want to sort of pick this up when we come back next week on that. But one thing I did want to talk about is this, and that's the idea of how does a consumer broaden his or her consumption? How do we capture this without borrowing? Is we simply earn more income. And so as a result, a shift in income to the right is a rightward shift in the consumption possibilities. So to be able to consume more, you have to earn more, right? And that's not exactly rocket science, right? So one thing that we do as we earn more is we push outward our consumption possibilities. And again, if you wanted to do 50 graphs around the room, you could do that, right? And then one thing that is bad about unemployment and whatnot, why we seek to try to prevent that, is the idea that it restricts consumption possibilities. The consumption possibilities go in this direction. And that's considered to be not particularly good, particularly if you're the one whose consumption possibilities budget line is shifting left. So this is considered to be broadening. This is considered to be narrowing. Okay. So when we come back on Tuesday, on Monday, I guess, we'll get into this idea of bringing dollars in the equation. I'm going to sort of expand upon this particular model here and bring dollars into it, and then talk about the final topic, dealing with utility, and that's marginal utility per dollar. Because we're going to say what benefit is, because if utils are themselves a little bit, smoke and mirrors, a little bit sort of hard to see and hard to get your arms around, well, then let's bring dollars into the picture, because one way that we can measure things pretty accurately is what people are willing to spend money on. When we know that, then we can say, this is how we know marginal utility is a thing, because we know people are willing to spend different amounts of dollars depending upon different amounts of marginal utility. Why is somebody willing to pay more for lobster than they are for a fillet of fish at McDonald's? It's because they get different utilities. It must mean that there's more utility from lobster than a fillet of fish. So that's something that I think we are pretty confident in asserting, despite the ephemeral and sort of smoke and mirrors nature of utility. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything we've talked about today with regard to utility and marginal utility, et cetera. Okay, well, everybody have a good weekend. When we come back on Monday, we will finish up this and then get into chapter 7. So have a great weekend.
And I'd like to, I didn't do very well